On this Tuesday night, the message from Afghanistan's militant group. The Taliban tries to strike a new tone after taking control of the country, but Canada isn't buying it.
They are a recognized terrorist organization.
Why the country's women and girls fear the power grab.
Their leadership says one thing, their foot soldiers are doing another thing.
A first look at how Canadians plan to vote. And will Nova Scotia's provincial election set the tone for the federal race? Ontario and Quebec roll out new mandatory vaccine measures. Who needs the shots to go to work? Plus, childcare and affordability, what the federal parties have planned for parents.
Without childcare, there is no coming out of this recession.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Robin Gill.
Another flight from Afghanistan has safely landed in Canada. Refugees from Kabul arrived this evening at Toronto's Pearson Airport. This is the area where the group was processed. Canada has promised to resettle 20,000 Afghan citizens at risk under the Taliban. Good evening and thank you for joining us. As Afghans flee in fear, the Taliban is settling in. Today, fighters patrolled the streets as their leaders launched a major public relations campaign. The militant group held its first news conference since taking Kabul. It's trying to convince the world it's changed. The group promised not to discriminate against women or seek revenge against opponents. But for those who lived through the Taliban's brutal rule in the 90s, there is unease and skepticism. Today, the Canadian government made its position on the Taliban takeover clear.
Canada has no plans to recognize the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. They are a recognized terrorist organization under Canadian law.
Justin Trudeau says Canada's priority is resettling as many Afghans as possible. But the reality is that many people desperate to flee may be stuck. The Prime Minister says the Taliban has now taken control of some key routes to the airport. Jackson Proskow begins our coverage with the situation on the ground in Kabul.
In vehicles that once belonged to the U.S.-backed government, Taliban fighters now patrol the streets of Kabul.
We are assuring the safety.
A Taliban spokesperson vowed we will not hold grudges, using an inaugural press conference to promise not to harm those who worked with the U.S. and its allies, also vowing to respect the rights of women. Few know what to believe, explains this 26-year-old university lecturer.
So mentally, people have been heartbroken. They have kind of a lot of concerns about their future, about their dreams, about their life, about their individual freedoms, and all the things which they have had from last 20 years.
Escape provides the only guarantee of safety. At the airport, thousands of American soldiers have arrived to provide security, to allow for the departure of foreign citizens and the Afghans who worked with them.
The Taliban have informed us that they are prepared to provide the safe passage of civilians to the airport.
After being caught so off guard by the rapid fall of the country, the U.S. now believes it has free rein to continue evacuation flights until the end of August.
We have had no hostile interactions, no attack, and no threat by the Taliban.
But given the Taliban's reputation for brutality, experts question whether the peace will really last, though leniency may be the only path to international legitimacy.
They're going to have a very hard time getting diplomatic recognition, any kind of economic assistance, any kind of trade opportunities in the region. They'll be a pariah state if they behave the way they did in the late 90s.
Rule by anyone but the Taliban is no longer an option. In the coming days, the Biden administration hopes to be able to airlift up to 9,000 people per day out of the country. This fragile moment may be the only time left to leave. Jackson Proskow, Global News, Washington.
Justin Trudeau faced a barrage of questions again today over the crisis in Afghanistan. He's been taking heat over refusing to clarify how Canada would view a Taliban government. Mercedes Stephenson reports from the campaign trail.
They have taken over and replaced a duly elected democratic government by force.
It's a much more clear and critical position than Trudeau took yesterday in Quebec, where he waffled on the answer of recognizing the Taliban. Royal Canadian Air Force planes and Special Operations Forces personnel have deployed to Kuwait to rescue Canadian and Afghan interpreters on the ground in Afghanistan. Yesterday, Mr. Trudeau said the planes would land as soon as the airfield was secured, but 24 hours later, the Department of National Defense still would not confirm that that had happened. Planes from the United States and India have landed. Scenes of desperation in Kabul have triggered calls for Canada to accept more Afghan refugees. Just before the election, Mr. Trudeau promised to accept 20,000, but those spots are actually from a pre-existing program and reserved for Afghans who have already fled the country, not those now caught under Taliban rule. Today, the Liberal leader is promising to accept as many Afghan refugees as possible, but did not give a number.
The Taliban need to ensure free access to people to get to the airport. We will continue to work with our international partners to put pressure on them to do just that.
The dire situation for Canadian interpreters on the ground remains, and while they are hopeful Canadian planes will be arriving to evacuate them, they still face major hurdles in the form of bureaucratic red tape. Canadian veterans groups working with interpreters say the forms are so complicated, many interpreters have not been able to complete them, even before the country fell to the Taliban. Today, the Prime Minister promised flexibility. Communication is another issue, Robin. Global News has been receiving texts from former interpreters saying they don't know when to go to the airport or how to board those Canadian planes.
Mercedes Stephenson in Barrie, Ontario. Thanks, Mercedes. Coming up a little later, the dangerous and uncertain future facing women and girls in Afghanistan. How the Taliban takeover is putting their rights and lives at stake, and the growing calls for help. Turning to the federal election campaign, today the Conservatives are selling Canadians a consumer policy they hope will win them votes. It's one the party has pitched before, a break from the GST. Abigail Bimman is traveling with leader Erin O'Toole. And Abigail, first of all, let's talk about the fact the leader is meeting with voters in person.
Well, Robin, as you can hear, he is about to have his first small COVID-safe rally. I asked the Conservative leader whether he feels he connects as well with voters virtually as he does in person. He didn't directly answer, but stressed that he's been meeting with tens of thousands by phone, and he's focused on campaigning safely.
Erin O'Toole moved his campaign from an empty Ottawa hotel to one in Toronto. He's hoping to sell his GST holiday plan to businesses and customers, no federal tax at retail stores throughout December, without actually meeting many of them yet.
You won't have to fill out any lengthy forms or applications to get this tax break. Your 5% discount will show up at the till at your favorite retailer.
He hopes it will bring more shoppers into brick-and-mortar stores battered by the pandemic. But some behind those tills say putting the onus on business means the return won't be worth the headache.
A lot of small business owners, in addition to not being computer scientists, are not accountants, and they're just getting by.
This former senior Conservative staffer says with growing evidence cost of living is the #1 issue for voters, the policy could be a winner.
It's certainly from the polling, it seems to hit all the right spots in terms of party support. And it's probably pretty popular in suburban areas, too, where the Conservatives need to win votes, especially in Ontario.
Mixed reaction from shoppers in downtown Toronto.
It's something I definitely would think about. And I think it's a great idea for the businesses to bring people in.
I think it's an election trick. You know, it's just a hollow promise. Really, it's in the long term, it's a puff in the pan.
Well, it's no surprise O'Toole's first in-person event is in the Greater Toronto area. That's a long-time Liberal-Conservative battleground in a region he'll have to pick up more seats in if he hopes to form government. After this, the Conservatives head to Quebec, another important area, one in which the Conservatives have an entire team devoted to winning extra seats in that province. Robin?
Abigail Bimman in Richmond Hill, Ontario. The NDP is the first campaign to hit the West Coast. The party is hoping to make some gains in British Columbia. Mike LeCouture is traveling with Jagmeet Singh in a riding New Democrats hope to reclaim. Mike.
Well, Robin, this Conservative riding has flipped between the NDP and Tories a number of times over the course of the last few elections. And the New Democrats believe they can win it back after losing it in 2019 by just 153 votes. There are several battlegrounds in BC that leader Jagmeet Singh has his eye on. Port Moody Coquitlam is just one of them. Now, Singh's pitch here is that an NDP government would invest heavily in small community businesses like the PPE maker he visited Tuesday.
A lot of the decisions that are made by governments are based on the will, and my will is to invest in local companies, to support Canadians, and in our times of need to have the capacity to produce and manufacture in Canada.
With the forest fires still raging in BC, Singh was also blaming the Trudeau Liberals for failing to tackle climate change and curb emissions. The NDP leader's pitch in this province is that an NDP government is the only one that would follow through with progressive environmental policies. The NDP firmly believes it can win over young progressive voters, and party insiders say they're even targeting Green MP Paul Manley's riding on Vancouver Island. Robin.
Mike Lacouture in Coquitlam, BC. Thanks, Mike. Here's how leaders strategize. Go into ridings where races are tight, campaign in places where there's opportunity to make gains. It's still early days, but campaigns really do matter, and elections are all about momentum. But for the moment, as Eric Sorensen reports, not much has changed for voters.
Masks and elbow bumps are different, but what if a $500 million election campaign really changed nothing? A few seats shuffled and another Liberal minority government. It's not what anyone seems to want. The party leaders all want change.
Here in Danforth, having someone like Claire Haxel will be someone who's going to fight for you.
The NDP believes it can make inroads on the Liberals by winning back former leader Jack Layton's old riding. The Conservative leader was in Toronto with plans to go to the nearby Richmond Hill riding, which his party lost to the Liberals by just 200 votes last time.
Everybody's going to be going after the Liberals. Given that the real focus right now is on whether it's going to be a Liberal minority or majority, the big push is going to be on those places where there are lots of seats available.
But the latest Ipsos survey suggests the status quo if the election were held now.
The Liberals' lead at the moment is about 5 points over the Conservatives, 36-31. Compared with the 2019 election results, the Liberals are up 3, the Conservatives down about 3, the NDP up 4. What really matters, though, are the number of seats to be won. At dissolution, the Liberals have 155 seats, and with a little bump in support, they're within striking distance of the majority of 170 seats. But all parties see in these numbers opportunities to make gains.
It's an incredible pleasure to be back here in Coburg, to see so many people out.
Like the other parties, the Liberals aren't playing defense. They also want change, to reclaim their majority. They're targeting ridings like this Eastern Ontario district they once held, but lost by 3 points to the Conservatives in 2019.
All parties are going to be playing offense in this election because there's very small differences in terms of the voting percentages overall are going to swing seats back and forth one way or the other. This election is going to be a game of inches.
With voter intentions so far changing very little, the parties are identifying close races they can swing in their favor. But as they poach from each other, the outcome for now looks not so different from the last election. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
There are reports an arrest warrant has been issued for Major General Danny Fortin, who is facing 1 count of sexual assault. His lawyers say he will turn himself into police tomorrow morning following a military investigation. He denies the allegation and has challenged the federal government on its decision to end his secondment to the vaccine task force. Quebec plans to make COVID-19 vaccines mandatory for healthcare workers. The mandate will apply to people who are in contact with patients for more than 15 minutes at a time. Premier François Legault says his government will debate the issue next week.
We have to take the balance. Of course, it's hard for the workers, but we have to protect patients.
Ontario is stepping up its health measures in response to the Delta variant. The province is requiring health and education workers to get vaccinated or take regular COVID-19 tests. As early as this week, 3rd shots will be offered to vulnerable people, including transplant patients and long-term care residents. And eligibility for the Pfizer vaccine will be extended to children who turn 12 this year.
We're making progress. It's just not quick enough. And I think these immunization policies will better protect Ontarians against the fall and are heading in the right direction.
Ontario is also pausing lifting further public health measures. A close race in Nova Scotia. Coming up, why the results in this provincial election matter to the federal campaign. We have breaking news in Nova Scotia where a Liberal gamble has gone in favour of the Progressive Conservatives. Global News has projected a PC government in that province. It's a blow to the provincial Liberals who were trying to get a third straight majority. Our Ross Lord has been watching this election. Ross, it was supposed to be a slam dunk. What went wrong for Ian Rankin's Liberal Party?
Well, they did have a big lead at the start of this campaign, Robin, but now that we know that the pendulum has swung from the Liberals to the PCs, it is time for the party and for others to look at it and look at that very question, what went wrong? Well, one thing that went wrong was that a pair of impaired driving incidents from Ian Rankin's young adult life resurfaced, and there were questions about how he handled expressing or fessing up to those. There were questions about the resignation of a candidate who says essentially she was forced to resign for reasons that a lot of people objected to. There was even trouble with Ian Rankin's communication strategy, which at times excluded media from some of his events. There were events that had happened that were only revealed after the fact in communication to media. So there's sort of a lot of things there to chew on. It was seen that Rankin came in at the tail end of Stephen McNeil's management of the COVID-19 issue, and then tried to parlay that into majority government. But the PCs under Tim Houston and the NDP under Gary Burrell hammered at him and his government over their, what they said, poor management of health care aside from COVID-19. So disjointed ambulance service, longer waiting lists for doctors.
Okay, Ross, that's all the time we have for you now.
As
Thank
we're
you
seeing,
so much.
That just crushed the Liberals.
Still ahead, childcare takes the election spotlight. The federal election will be, among other things, a referendum on Justin Trudeau's $10 a day national child care plan. Before the election call, the Liberals were making campaign-style announcements on the issue. Here's Anne Gaviola on what early childhood experts and parents are saying.
Finding childcare actually was a nightmare.
Bridget Casey is a working mom who spends a huge chunk of her paycheck on childcare for her daughter.
Right now, her daycare bill is over $1,000 per month. It's not quite as high as my rent, but it's close.
Because this pandemic has disproportionately impacted working parents, especially working mothers, policy experts say a federal childcare strategy should be front and center in this election.
We are not going to get back to economic normal while women are still back in the home. And without childcare, there is no coming out of this recession.
The Liberals remain committed to their $30 billion plan to create a $10 a day national childcare program, which 7 provinces plus the Yukon have already signed on to. The NDP's platform includes a universal $10 a day program for all parents, while the Conservatives have a different strategy, a refundable tax credit program to cover a maximum of 75% of daycare costs for low-income families to replace the $10 a day plan. Critics of the tax credit approach question its impact.
There's no benefits for families that are earning more than $150,000 per year. And that sounds like a lot to many families, but that is still like a middle-class family in Toronto.
One concern with the $10 a day plan is in its implementation. Big provinces like Ontario and Alberta aren't yet on board.
There isn't enough in the deals that we've seen to date, which require the provinces and territories to put in the infrastructure, the kind of infrastructure which supports our public education system.
As we approach Election Day, some parents want to hear a wide range of options.
I would love to see federal leaders start looking into alternatives of child care, whether that be spouses taking leave of absence from work where their job is still secure.
According to Scotiabank research, childcare is the single biggest household expenditure for the average Canadian family, which means this affordability issue could be the biggest ballot box issue for families, too. Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
Up next, fears the Taliban could erase progress made for women's rights in Afghanistan.
I am deeply concerned about the situation in Afghanistan right now, especially about the safety of women and girls there. This is actually an urgent humanitarian crisis right now that we need to provide our help and support.
In 2012, Malala Yousafzai was shot by the Taliban for defending girls' education in Pakistan. Today, she says she fears for her sisters in Afghanistan. The future they were promised is slipping away, and there are fears of a return to the Taliban's ultra-conservative Islamic rule that severely restricts the movements of women. Today, a spokesperson for the Taliban said women will be allowed to work and study as long as it's within the framework of Islamic law. But as Redmond Shannon reports, women's rights groups say they'll believe it when they see it.
Barely 48 hours since they took control, and the Taliban are suggesting they've changed.
Women will be afforded all their rights, whether it is in work or other activities, because women are a key part of society. And we are guaranteeing all their rights within the limits of Islam.
What the limits of Islam amount to is something they did not elaborate on. During Taliban rule in the 90s, girls over 10 could not go to school, women could not work or leave the house alone, and they had to wear a burqa. Perhaps one encouraging sign Tuesday, a female news anchor interviewing a Taliban spokesperson. The dramatic scenes of mostly men at Kabul airport may indicate women are not venturing outside. There are reports of female students and employees being sent home, women's images being whitewashed away. Concern for the future of women and girls won't be lessened by mere words.
For me, it honestly, it doesn't make sense to believe that Taliban would change their policies towards women, towards children, and their basic rights.
Even if I go somewhere else, I will always have a target on my back.
Pashtana Durrani runs a girls' education NGO and is asking the world not to give up on Afghan women.
Every Canadian watching it right now can do it by calling their leaders to pressurize the Taliban into accepting educational rights for girls, that is general educational rights, and then at the same time for working rights for Afghan women.
Durrani has gone into hiding for now, but insists she won't live in fear and wants to talk to the Taliban about the future of women in her country. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
And that is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Robin Gill. Tonight, your Canada is Commonwealth Stadium in Edmonton. Thank you for watching. Have a great night.